When it comes to replacing your roof, choosing the right contractor is crucial to ensuring the job is done correctly, on time, and within your budget. Roofing Warren stands out as one of the top choices for homeowners in the area looking for quality, reliability, and expertise in roof replacement. Whether your roof is old, damaged, or simply in need of an upgrade, Roofing Warren offers a comprehensive range of services designed to meet the unique needs of your home. Here's why Roofing Warren is your best choice for roof replacement. Expert craftsmanship and experience. One of the biggest advantages of choosing Roofing Warren is their team's wealth of experience and skill. With years of experience in the industry, their roofing contractors have handled every type of roof replacement project imaginable. Whether it's a simple asphalt shingle roof, a more intricate metal roof, or a flat roof, Roofing Warren has the expertise to get the job done right. Quality workmanship. Roofing Warren takes pride in their craftsmanship. From the initial consultation to the final inspection, their team ensures every aspect of the roof replacement is handled with precision and care. Knowledge of local climate. Roofs in Warren need to withstand local weather conditions, from heavy rains to snow and ice. Roofing Warren is familiar with the specific challenges posed by the local climate and will ensure that your new roof is durable and able to stand up to the elements. Their professional team delivers high-quality roof replacements designed to last, so you can be confident that your home is well protected. Comprehensive services and custom solutions. A roof replacement is more than just swapping out shingles. It's about addressing the underlying needs of your home's roofing system. Roofing Warren offers a wide range of services that go beyond a simple roof replacement, providing customized solutions based on your specific needs. Inspection and assessment. Roofing Warren provides thorough roof inspections and assessments before recommending a roof replacement. This ensures that any hidden issues, such as leaks, mold, or structural damage, are identified and addressed. Tailored solutions. Based on the assessment, Roofing Warren will recommend the most suitable materials and solutions for your roof replacement. They offer a variety of roofing materials, including asphalt shingles, metal roofing, tile, and more, so you can choose the option that best fits your style, budget, and durability requirements. With Roofing Warren, you're not just getting a roof replacement, you're getting a tailored solution designed to meet the unique needs of your home and budget. Affordable pricing with transparent estimates. Roof replacement can be a significant investment, so it's important to choose a contractor that offers competitive pricing and honest, upfront estimates. Roofing Warren is committed to providing fair and transparent pricing, ensuring that homeowners understand exactly what they are paying for. Free estimates. Roofing Warren offers free, no-obligation estimates for roof replacements. They'll inspect your roof, discuss your options, and provide a detailed breakdown of costs before any work begins. This transparency helps eliminate any surprises or hidden fees down the line. Budget-friendly options. Roof replacements don't have to break the bank. Roofing Warren works with homeowners to find the best materials and solutions that fit their budget while still delivering long-lasting, high-quality results. Their commitment to affordable pricing ensures you can get the roof replacement you need without compromising on quality. Timely and efficient roof replacement. When it comes to roof replacement, time is often of the essence. A damaged or old roof can leave your home vulnerable to leaks and weather-related issues, so you need a roofing contractor who can complete the job efficiently and within the agreed timeframe. Roofing Warren understands the urgency and works diligently to ensure your roof replacement is completed on time. Quick turnaround. Roofing Warren's team works efficiently, minimizing disruption to your daily life while ensuring the job is done right. They'll provide a clear timeline and ensure that your roof replacement project stays on track. Attention to detail. Even with a quick turnaround, Roofing Warren doesn't compromise on quality. Their team ensures that every detail is addressed, from proper installation to cleanup, leaving your home safe and secure with a brand new roof. Guaranteed quality and warranties. Roofing Warren stands behind their work and offers strong warranties on both materials and labor. This means that, should any issues arise after the roof replacement, you can count on them to make things right without additional cost to you. Manufacturer warranties. The materials used by Roofing Warren come with manufacturer warranties, so you can rest assured that your roof will stand the test of time. Workmanship warranties. In addition to material warranties, Roofing Warren also offers workmanship warranties. If any problems arise due to faulty installation, they will address the issue promptly and at no extra cost to you. Their commitment to warranties gives homeowners peace of mind, knowing that their investment is protected. Customer-focused service. Above all, Roofing Warren is known for its customer-centric approach. They understand that a roof replacement can be stressful, and they work closely with homeowners to ensure a smooth, hassle-free experience. Clear communication. From the first consultation to the final inspection, Roofing Warren communicates clearly with homeowners, keeping them informed every step of the way. Professionalism. The team at Roofing Warren is friendly, respectful, and professional. They ensure that the job site is kept clean and that all work is completed to the highest standards. Their commitment to excellent customer service ensures that your roof replacement is a positive experience from start to finish. Conclusion. If you're in need of a roof replacement in Warren, look no further than Roofing Warren. With expert craftsmanship, affordable pricing, and timely, efficient service, they are the best choice for homeowners looking to upgrade their roof. Whether you need a simple repair or a complete roof replacement, Roofing Warren provides quality, personalized solutions that meet your needs and budget. Trust their team to protect your home with a durable, reliable roof that will last for years to come.